Hey YouTube, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to talk about disproportionate and unique health risks for women in prostitution. And this is going to be a heavy subject, so I'll just say this once at the beginning, proceed with caution if you're not having a good day. The reality is that women in the sex trade are at higher and sometimes unique risks compared to other occupations. Whether the industry is criminalized, partially or completely legal. This is an uncomfortable truth that we have to acknowledge if we want adequate support and health services for people in an exodus from prostitution. It's also vital to paint a realistic picture of what entry into the sex trade may entail for those considering it in the future. It's not the woman or man or trans person selling sex who's the issue. The dangers stem from, frequently, very specifically, the sex buyer, the interaction of prostitution itself. The sex buyer is rarely discussed, even though for every sex seller there are many, many more of him. He is the one who demands certain sex acts. He's the one refusing condom or dental dam use, and he's often a perpetrator of mental or physical violence. So when we talk about risk, let's try not to imagine a woman alone in a room, but to include in our mental image the man, or men, plural, whose physical presence and behavior poses the risk. With this in mind, I will list disproportionate and unique health risks for women in prostitution, with a focus on the body. And with an emphasis that, depressingly, these risks are not simply a byproduct of prohibitionist policies, but continue to be experienced by women in countries like mine, Germany, or New Zealand. These risks are also shared between women who might legally be defined as trafficked and those who are not, those with and without health coverage, those driven by poverty, and those with options. The absence of a tangible third-party exploiter simply does not create a reliable shield from the following risks. And I'll give sources for everything. And I want to say now that the authors of these sources absolutely include both people who view prostitution as violence and those who view it as work, and includes meta-analysis and national studies and sex work health guides and in-depth reports from medical practitioners. Chronic pain. Since this video was inspired by the assertion that the impacts of retail work are similar or worse than those from the sex trade, let's begin with a look at chronic pain. Joint pain and arthritis are common long-term consequences women in the sex industry suffer. This includes chronic wrist, arm, and shoulder pain from hand jobs, jaw and throat pain from blow jobs, which leads some women to use dental numbing sprays, hip and back pain from the heavy weight of sex buyers, as well as knee and feet pain from high heels and crouch positions. It's also not rare to suffer from muscle or chest pain. These health problems do not materialize out of thin air, but are direct consequences of everyday requirements made of women in the sex trade, which involve withstanding the aggressive motions and heavy bodies of sex buyers, who are quite aware that the women they are paying are frequently in pain during or after the act. Like all the girls there, she has back pain. Wasn't allowed to touch her in a few places. She just lies there uninterested and expects it to be over in a few minutes. She has back pain and her vagina stings. Missionary is tricky because of her back. She's either hurting or I'm tickling her. Total ripoff. Within this profession, pain often goes along with regular intercourse or even oral. The ladies simply want to get things over with fast. Injuries. There's a range of injuries that can result from prostitution, both from additional violence perpetrated usually by sex buyers or pimps, but also from the everyday demands made of the body. This includes bruises, contusions, pulled muscles, wounds, fractures, broken bones, and even internal injuries. Several studies point to the exceptionally high number of head injuries, concussions, and brain trauma amongst prostituted women, which result from being hit with objects, having their head slammed against hard surfaces, or being violently shaken or asphyxiated. These types of harms are not unique to the sex trade. However, these are things we don't normally tolerate sustaining during sex. We'd be concerned if we did suffer them or a loved one did. In the context of the sex trade, it also has to be understood that many women cannot afford to take time off to heal. Just economically, they can't. And that they have to go right back, despite pain and risk of worsening injury. The client asked me, "Are you okay with fisting?" I answered, "You can if you do it carefully." It resulted in 3 cuts. I was bleeding, and he threw me naked out on the stairwell. Nobody asked me what was going on when I showed up to the brothel of bruises. I wasn't different though. I didn't want to know what was going on when I saw 2 Romanian women putting makeup over hematomas. Well, she's got a few bruises. Maybe the last punter wasn't all that nice to her. Gynecological and abdominal health. Prostitution is the only job that happens inside the body. Consequently, unique risks include gynecological health problems such as vaginal pH damage, inflammation, infection, tears, fissures, injury, and prolapse, increased risk of cervical cancer, weakened pelvic floor, irregular and painful menstruation. And many women cannot take breaks when they're menstruating. They put in sponges, for example, and continue. And even infertility. Proctological health problems are a direct consequence of high demand for brutal anal sex, normalized in the last few decades through pornography, and frequent enemas. And the risks include chronic abdominal pain, gastrointestinal and digestive issues, bowel inflammation, destroyed bowel environments, anal tears, fissures, injury, and prolapse. And these will overlap for prostitution and pornography. Many survivors of the sex trade who are survivors of both prostitution and porn have said pornography is kind of just prostitution with a camera. A highly common impact of prostitution on women's bodies include reoccurring bladder infections from repeated penetration by men with inadequate hygiene, as well as the use of diaphragms, which can worsen into cystitis and kidney problems, with some women being forced, not just by pimps, but again, economic necessity, to keep selling despite being in pain. To avoid this, many women preemptively take antibiotics, which pose myriad potential side effects. Some women also suffer temporary or permanent urine and stool incontinence. And that's another issue that I hope to cover in the future, where I'm still doing a lot of reading and talking to other people, which is there is a range of disabilities that result from prostitution. When it comes to prostitution and disability, we like talking about the disabled sex buyer. We don't like talking about that women who are disabled are at increased risk of entering into the sex trade, and also that prostitution itself can cause disabilities. The things I just listed, the vaginal, gynecological, and proctological problems are a direct cause of overexertion and mechanical trauma of sexual organs by more penetration than the body can physically handle. Some of these things can happen to anybody who has sex, but they are disproportionately likely to happen to you if, just by the number of sex partners, the lack of arousal, many other things that occur for many women in prostitution. I really, really don't want to feed into this image of women in prostitution as dirty. Women in prostitution, they go to great lengths to keep the entire body as clean as possible. Unfortunately, some of these cleanliness practices, like repeated rinsing and douching of the vulva and vagina, sometimes with chemicals, they can make all kinds of health problems worse, or they can cause health problems in of themselves. All of these symptoms and this need to scrub and clean, they are all a direct cause of the sex buyers and their demand for quick, easy access to female bodies, such that it's not rare for women to see multiple buyers a day, sometimes up to 10 or 20 men. So this is not just like a woman having sex because she enjoys it with her partner once a day. These are entirely different circumstances. And again, sex buyers are fully aware that women they see frequently suffer from such problems. She doesn't want anal because it causes her terrible pain, and she already has a fissure because of it. Sexually transmitted infections. As is commonly known, prostitution exposes you to risk of infection with STIs, including thrush, crabs, scabies, bacterial vaginosis, pelvic inflammatory disease, trichomoniasis, genital warts, genital herpes, gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, and hepatitis. Sex worker safety guidelines inform women on how to inspect men's genitals for signs of e.g. sores. Although how easily she can kick him out when he's already naked below the waist is another question. There is also the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS. Though there is a debate about how much this is due to shared needle use versus contact with sex buyers, the presence of a gigantic sex trade-related global prevention program would suggest that there is a problem. These are some of the concerns associated with condom slippage and breaking, as well as sex buyers resisting and refusing condoms. Frequent condom use, unfortunately, also has adverse risks for some, as a minority develop a latex allergy that may result in asthma, anaphylaxis, and other serious reactions. There's also the fact that condom use does not protect from all types of STIs, such as HPV and genital ulcers. And that transmission of, e.g., gonorrhea and chlamydia may also occur when men ejaculate on women's faces, again popularized by pornography, and their semen makes contact with her eyes. On a side note, STIs are not the only kinds of infections that women need to and try to protect themselves from. One reason women refuse to kiss sex buyers, aside from not wanting to, because of disgust, is the risk of contracting pneumonia, bronchitis, and possibly tuberculosis. So in researching this, I learned a lot of new things I didn't know about that. For example, that came from a pro-prostitution source. There are indeed other jobs where people may become infected with various diseases, including STIs. However, a hospital, for example, requires staff to wear gloves, face masks, and other protective gear when potentially handling bodily fluids for this precise reason. It's not possible to align prostitution with occupational health and safety requirements because sexual access to a woman who is in full body protective gear is not appealing to the men who pay, nor would it even pass the OSHA regulations in, for example, the US, even then. Additionally, there exists a subset of sex buyers who purposefully seek out vulnerable women, especially those homeless and addicted, for maximal power trip and the thrill of playing Russian roulette with the lives of everyone involved. Prostitution is the only job that involves direct contact with saliva, semen, blood, and potentially urine and feces. Historically, a huge amount of stigma against women in prostitution has been the association with sexually transmitted illnesses, the public and policymakers framing them as disease carriers, which often leads to justifying forced medical exams. And these are slowly being recognized as a human rights violation, but they're still practiced in many places around the world, including places with legal prostitution, because a bunch of states do not legalize prostitution because they care about women. They do it as some kind of supposed public health matter because they care about the health of sex buyers, many of whom are influential men in society. So these mandatory medical checkups that we understand, like a gynecologist putting instruments in a woman's vagina when she hasn't freely consented to that, is a violation. Somehow we have trouble understanding that when a man inserts a penis in a woman's vagina, when she doesn't desire him and has economic necessity and this is her survival, we don't see it. But with medical exams, we're slowly agreeing that maybe this is wrong. But it's still being practiced in places like Austria and Nevada. Here in Austria, we check each and every one of the women for STIs, and still we deport 7 to 8 girls per week because they gotten infected. Sometimes it's only syphilis, but sometimes it's HIV. Well, it's up to you to decide if you want to keep seeing that Eastern European vermin. So a very strong illustration about how that stigma that society has, seeing women as disease carriers, of course strongly extends to sex buyers. Anyone who investigates the sex trade will quickly learn that women fight a hard battle to protect themselves as best as possible. I really want to emphasize this. Women in prostitution are not trying to play Russian roulette. It's sex buyers who do that. Women are trying really hard to stay healthy and to stay clean, right? Because the average woman is just trying to feed herself and her family, and she wants to come back home as healthy as possible to her kids. It's sex buyers and pimps who actively and intentionally fight against condom use. The pimp, because he can then charge more money, and the sex buyer, because he can then have more superficial pleasure. And the passing on of STIs to long-term or casual partners outside the sex trade, that's often the sex buyer who does that. And he may then transmit it back to the woman in the trade. It is sex buyers who come up with such demeaning and harmful practices, such as making women drink their urine, such that outreach NGOs, again, pro-sex industry, have to warn women that this too risks STI infection. Sex buyers are the cause and the problem, not the allies in the battle for sex sellers' sexual health and against the spread of sexual diseases, which, with the advent of new incurable STIs such as supergonorrhea and the continued prevalence of HIV/AIDS, because not everyone has access to life-extending treatments. It's not a pearl-clutching matter. It's a real public health risk. Pregnancy and abortion. Prostitution is the only occupation that can result in an unwanted pregnancy, which may require an abortion, which of course isn't available in all countries. Or only up to a certain point, and this is where medical practitioners tell us because abdominal pain is so common for women and many other medical health issues that may mask the symptoms of pregnancy. A lot of women don't even realize they're pregnant and they might be over the legal limit. So women may have to carry some of these unwanted pregnancies to term, aside from the fact that having to just sit there and think about it and feel it through and make that decision. Do I want this child? Do I not want it? What do I do about it? Or will I give it up for adoption? That is a super personal and painful decision. And prostitution is the only job that might make you have to make those decisions. To avoid unwanted pregnancy, women in prostitution take contraceptives, which again are not available to all of them. And these, when they are, also carry their own health risks, such as blood clots, especially in connection with smoking, and which are more likely to fail if the woman is also suffering from the issues that we already talked about, such as chronic digestive problems. Many sex buyers very much do not want to use a condom, like we talked about, and they may push and pressure a woman or simply exploit her economic distress not to use it. And they may also commit stealthing, which is the removal of the condom during intercourse without consent. There is also demand among sex buyers for pregnant women, including for practices such as gangbangs, which is a group of men in Germany, up to 30, all after each other, penetrating a woman who is in a state of advanced pregnancy. Not that it would be fine and harmless if she wasn't pregnant, but just to show you what the demand means in practice. Because it's not a man who wants to like stroke her belly a little bit, which if you don't like that man would also, by the way, be quite upsetting. But yeah, it's 30 men all after each other penetrating a woman in a state of advanced pregnancy. Prostitution is a high-risk environment for pregnant women, putting her at increased risk for STIs, fetal injury, and miscarriage. Prostitution of pregnant women is in violation of nearly all aspects of maternal protection law. In the example of Germany, that includes the ban on night shifts, double shifts, working weekends, doing physically strenuous work, repetitive motions, and coming into contact with hazardous substances, such as bodily fluids. Most women in prostitution are independent contractors with no maternity leave, and they're forced to work in accordance with their economic distress. Many continue close or up to the day of delivery and return right after giving birth, which puts them at risk of severe and sometimes permanent gynecological injuries, such as perennial tears. And of course, women may run risk of passing on, for example, HIV/AIDS to the fetus, and they still die in childbirth all around the world, and from unsafe, self-attempted, or illegal abortions. Women in prostitution being forced to give children up for adoption or having them removed occurs frequently, not just under prohibition, but in places with legal prostitution too, as living situations are frequently considered unsafe by authorities, especially for women in straight prostitution. And I will absolutely concur with my political opposition that the assumption that women in prostitution are inherently bad mothers, which is completely unfair and inaccurate, also means there is an increased risk of removal. But this stigma is still very prevalent even when it's legal. The kitten still lets you pump her full of cum, though she's currently heavily pregnant. Who done it, huh? Those who like that kind of thing should make use of the opportunity pretty soon. But the lady only manages to do 1 or 2 positions and constantly has to take breaks. Cosmetic procedures. As much as we like to say that the sex industry sells a service, it's the attractiveness of women's bodies that's central to their ability to make money and put food on the table. Therefore, looks are paramount. The sex trade is not the only industry with a high rate of plastic surgery, because yes, there's modeling and there's acting, but it takes cosmetic interventions to a new extreme as all parts of the body are under scrutiny. Procedures on the face include injections and reshaping surgeries on the brows, forehead, eyes, nose, cheeks, lips, and chin. The abdomen area may be altered via tummy tuck or liposuction, which can cause damage to internal organs. Breast and butt implants are common, and labiaplasty rates are likely highest for women in prostitution and porn than for any other group. All major surgical interventions include risk of bruising, swelling, scarring, pain, infection, and in the worst cases, necrosis. It should come as no surprise that it is beauty trends set by the porn industry that propel a lot of the overall sex trade surgery market. Never had such fucking awesome porn sex. Absolute optic fuck with top-notch service, tattooed with perfectly sculptured silicone breasts. Chances of returning, 100%. Youth is a factor sought after by most sex buyers, meaning that women age out of the market by their late 30s. There are middle-aged and older women selling sex, but most men will pay the highest price for women 18 to 25. creating an economic need for cosmetic interventions that give the appearance of use, such as Botox, facelifts, and again, as no part of the body is off limits, vaginal rejuvenation surgery, which tightens the vaginal and perineum area but risks nerve damage and scarring. The girl looks like a rundown porn actress and is surgically altered to look young and skinny. She had a facelift, with a slight mask-like face. The breasts, B-cups were tuned, but the result is second-rate. She's slim, but she doesn't show her belly or waist, because it's probably her visual weak point. There are entire plastic surgery clinics leeching off strip clubs and brothels and the porn industry. Make no mistake, the plastic surgery industry is a multi-billion-dollar business, and it does not care about women's well-being any more than any other capitalist industry. Women in the sex trade moving through the revolving doors of plastic surgeons is such a common phenomenon that some NGOs have issued guidance for surgeons to recognize victims of human trafficking among them. Women and trans people in prostitution are also sometimes victimized by black market cosmetic product sellers carrying out illegal and particularly medically unsound procedures. And of course, there's always a small but substantial risk of death on the surgery table. Especially people who've undergone multiple procedures may suffer deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism. Physical violence, rape, and murder. Women in prostitution are at risk of robbery, rape, and murder on the job, mostly at the hands of sex buyers, but also brothel owners, pimps, organized crime, strangers, and police. Forms of harassment include verbal abuse, threats, unwanted touching or kissing, and stalking. Violent acts include slapping, arm twisting, kicking, punching, strangling, being tied up, being locked up, burned, threatened with a knife or gun. In the age of digital media, it should be noted that perpetrators repeatedly film these crimes, sometimes in the form of torture porn, and that rapes include forced reenactment of pornographic scenes. Women in prostitution in the US are 18 times more likely to be murdered than a comparable sample of the general population, at a rate higher than soldiers, taxi drivers, or liquor store salespeople. And I would like to quote German or New Zealand statistics instead, but neither of these countries is looking into this issue. In Germany, our Bureau of Statistics has explicitly said that the very collection of statistics on sex trade homicide is stigmatizing, and therefore they won't do it. But there have been over 100 murders in Germany, and a lot more attempted, and in New Zealand there's been at least 7 or 8 that we know of. These murders are usually in direct connection with the sex trade, i.e. were committed by sex buyers, robbers, rapists, sadists, and or pimps, and all of these groups, of course, overlap. And I've written a blog post about this, and I might make a video in the future summarizing it. You can find it in the description if you want to know more about sex trade homicide. Violence is not an issue tangential to the sex trade. One of the most common scenarios where violence occurs is during the sale of sex, when price negotiations escalate or customers are dissatisfied with the service, or transfer their rage over impotence and other personal frustrations onto women who are physically vulnerable due to being naked, being penetrated, being tied up in BDSM practices, or when intoxicated or high. It's objective fact, unfortunately. A woman alone in a room with a sexually entitled man who is naked is not powerful. The assumption that women get rich from prostitution and they often carry large sums of money is an additional motivator to misogynistic attackers and robbers. Violence at the hands of the men who pay is a real everyday concern for women in all sectors of the sex trade, not just the street. It's why groups and individuals of all political persuasions give advice that includes dress codes to avoid being grabbed or dragged, rape alarms, informing another person about whereabouts, photographing license plates, carrying and sharing back client lists, and obtaining a protector or a pimp. Contrary to frequent claims, extensive screening techniques, such as demanding an ID, extended interviews with men before meeting them, these are not tools available to the vast majority of women, including in countries where sex buying is legal. Market forces alone force the majority to repeatedly accept men who appear dubious or unsafe. And of course, no one has the magical skill to reliably identify who is going to get violent once the door closes and who is not, and no one should have to have that skill. Not all women will end up experiencing these kinds of violence or any of these medical issues, but all live with the fear that they might, which leads into the next issue, which is mental health. This video does not focus on the mental health risks associated with prostitution, but because they make up a huge section of what women in and out of the sex trade report to be suffering from, I'll give a brief overview here. Women in and exited from the sex trade. suffer disproportionate rates of sleep disorders, including insomnia, hypersomnia, and chronic nightmares, which are worsened by long shifts, night shifts, irregular sleeping patterns, and sleeping in the workbed. Eating disorders are not unusual either, including binge eating, bulimia, anorexia, and just general malnutrition, which is again helped along by the high stress environment of prostitution. And there are many other jobs where people have problems with sleep, with nutrition, but in prostitution we have to consider again all the aforementioned health risks, and these two worsen those. If you're sleeping well and you're eating badly, your body doesn't heal so well and it doesn't cope so well with stress. Physical symptoms of revulsion and emotional distress include chronic headaches, dizziness, exhaustion, nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, skin disorders, hair loss, and premature aging. So these are symptoms that when the woman shows up to the doctor, if she's someone who has access to a medical system and she says, I'm suffering from this and this and this, they can't find a cause, or they may not be able to find one. Because just stress alone, emotional distress, can make your body do all of these things. Suppressing your disgust is one of the most important skills that you need in prostitution. Many punters aren't even bothered when the prostitute throws up. While not the most obviously distressing, women also report decreased libido and the inability to experience sexual pleasure. And this is also an issue that women, once they're out of the sex trade, as many of these mental health problems are, they continue to struggle with that oftentimes. And I don't want to generalize because, of course, it's a diverse population and some women have very happy and healthy sexuality after, some struggle, but then they find their way. But some women never want to have sex again. They can never enjoy sex again, or even masturbation, because repeatedly having to perform it and experiencing those situations is traumatizing. It can kill your own sexuality, which is not a trivial loss at all, and the most sex negative thing that can possibly happen. Sex negative, sex positive, these words are not very useful once we talk about the reality of prostitution, are they? They don't really capture the degree of the injury caused. Discussions of some kind of vague sex positivity have absolutely no place in the debate about prostitution, if you ask me. Trauma symptoms include low self-esteem, irritability, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, compulsive spending, which is a huge issue, including for women who get out of prostitution, because you might make money fast in the moment, but then there's the need to spend it because women themselves feel like the money is kind of dirty, or there's trauma attached to the money, and you don't want it around and close to you for a long time. And also you want to reward yourself from all the stuff you had to go through, you had to endure. And that leads to compulsive spending. Dissociation, which is not being emotionally present, especially while experiencing unwanted touch and penetration by sex buyers. And this is a common survival mechanism and trauma response shared with victims of rape and domestic violence. Self-harm, for example, cutting, which leaves scars, these sex buyers can and do see. Suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts, and just suicide. Also quite common in the porn industry again. These mental health symptoms for many women last longer than the physical ones, and many who have left the sex trade report struggling with these years or decades later. And some will heal and recover, and some will not. Some will struggle with these for the rest of their lives. She said, "The job is destroying me. I had a hunch from the facial expressions, the quick leaving of the bed and running into the shower, etc., but only really registered it when she made comments like, 'This fucks me up in the head,' or that she can only do the job for a couple of weeks and then needs to really take long breaks in order not to break down." The reality is that this job essentially kills the soul of a lot of girls over time. Alcohol and drugs are then used to numb the pain. Substance use and addiction. As a consequence of constant unbearable situations, many women in the sex trade, especially but by no means exclusively on the street, consume legal and illicit substances at above average rates, such that advice on safer drug consumption is part of many sex worker safety manuals handed out by, again, pro-prostitution outreach organizations. Addiction tends to precede prostitution, but it may be worsened or caused by the reality of prostitution. Legal recreational drugs often consumed in high quantities or constituting an addiction include alcohol, cigarettes, and hashish. Prescription pills common in the prostitute population include painkillers, sedatives, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety agents. Psychostimulants include speed, meth, cocaine, crack, ecstasy, angel dust, acid, and others. Opioids include fentanyl and heroin. It's not unusual for women to consume multiple substances in short succession or to suffer from polyaddiction. All of these substances are associated with various risks of physical and mental health, including severe organ damage and, of course, death by accident, overdose, and HIV/AIDS. And just try to imagine all the other things that we talked about in this video already, trying to make him use the condom, trying to make sure it stays on, trying to not get this in your mouth and this in your eye and all of that while you're high. Because many women consume mind-altering substances while they're selling sex in order to endure and tolerate and survive. But this also means they're clearly not able to give consent. And sex buyers are, again, completely aware of this, but they really seem worried when they discuss it about consequences for accessing a woman intoxicated, dissociated, or via a drug, or just struggling with addiction. This is really a commonly tolerated part of the sex trade. It is also not rare for sex buyers to encourage alcohol or drug consumption. In the case of illicit substances, the buyer is often the one providing the substance. And of course, sometimes he pays in the form of drugs rather than money. And many sex buyers themselves are drunk or high while they're paying for sex, which makes them even more dangerous than they already are. I noticed immediately that she was plastered, but that wasn't a problem for me because I've always wanted to fuck a drunk whore. Of course she looks sick and her arms show she's shooting drugs. Banging a junkie is just some people's kink. She's the only one who agreed to blow me and swallow. She's also on crystal meth, which was not good, but I still wank about her. Nothing that I said in this video is intended to frame women in prostitution as broken, disgusting, or weak. The same as if I was discussing any other group of marginalized people or survivors of violence. Women in and exited from the sex trade are a diverse group of people, and they're equally intelligent and capable to the rest of the population. Many of the risks listed here, however, do showcase very clearly why the sex industry is not a job provider and the sex buyer is not a customer like any other. The only groups of people deserving the labels broken or disgusting are men who ignore women's economic or health distress and their physical pain and cause this harm to their bodies or profit from it. Women in the sex trade are extremely resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. And sacrificing women's health for men's pleasure is unacceptable. Women deserve a life free from objectification and injury and violence, and the continuance of the sex trade is diametrically opposed to these goals. I'm not saying every woman will experience these, but these are the risks. And is that really just like your job at your retail job, your service job, your desk job? Are these really the same? And what is the solution when prostitution becomes legal? Do we need to eliminate the protections workers, at least theoretically, already have, and that some can sue for because prostitution cannot comply with them? Should we just change our OSHA regulations to accommodate the sex trade, which means decreasing the rights of all workers? Or should we say, here's this group of people where the things we don't tolerate anywhere else, we're just gonna tolerate. And that is the approach that Germany and New Zealand have taken. Essentially, they've said there's not very much we can do to mitigate these risks. There's a little bit, like telling women how to make men put on condoms. We can give them a little bit of advice. If women have some medical knowledge, that's better than having none. That's another thing to consider. That women who come from the poorest parts of Southeast Asia, in the case of New Zealand, or Eastern Europe, in Germany, they may not have had any sex ed. So giving them some is better than nothing, but at the end, we're still tolerating things that we just don't tolerate for any other industry. And in my opinion, we thereby make women in the sex trade second-class citizens. We're saying, none of us want to endure this. Not our partners, not our bodies, not our children, but you, the migrant, you, the poor woman, the working class woman, the racialized woman, or any other minority group, for you, this is good enough. And actually, we're being incredibly gracious, not arresting you. And yeah, here's a guide on how to spot genital warts. Even though I believe a lot of people doing this do have good intentions, and I wouldn't want to eliminate all of what they do because I think we also need harm reduction. We're asking women to sort of like professionalize out of these harms. There's still so much focus on her because even the people who are in favor of the sex trade realize they have like basically no power over sex buyers and brothel owners. So she is the only person that they can adjust something with or meddle with. But nothing is going to fundamentally change from these like professionalization campaigns, teaching her how to make a really good online ad, teaching her how to put on a condom with her mouth without the sex buyer noticing, and these kinds of things. At the end, if it's always about her and she needs to be professional, and women who are tough enough, they can handle this job, they won't get sick, they won't get an STI, they won't get hurt, they won't get harmed, they won't get murdered. Spreading that mentality furthers victim blaming. This mentality is super prevalent in Germany. It is actively furthered by the pro-sex industry lobby. It claims to empower women, but it actually leads to victim blaming. And our society hasn't stopped viewing women as disease carriers. And now instead of criminals, it thinks they're greedy nymphos. I'll make another video talking about framing prostitution as labor and how that backfires. This is one of it, and it ties very clearly to the health problems. Pretending that prostitution is a job like any other does not empower women. It obscures harm. It obscures the perpetrators of harm.